The jungle of New Guinea in late 1943 was a theater of war where nature itself felt like a hostile combatant. Beneath the emerald canopy of the Huon Peninsula, the terrain was a vertical nightmare of limestone ridges and suffocating undergrowth. By November, the air was thick with the smell of rotting vegetation, cordite, and the metallic tang of blood. The rain was constant, a relentless deluge that turned steep mountain tracks into rivers of black, slippery mud. Strewn across the slopes were the bodies of men who had fallen in an attempt to dislodge a deeply entrenched enemy. The mission seemed impossible. The casualty lists were growing, and the morale of the Allied advance was beginning to fray under the sheer weight of Japanese resistance. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion and looming failure that a single moment occurred. A moment that defies standard military logic. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, eerie shadows over the battlefield, an order was issued for the Allied units to retreat. The day's assault had been a disaster, and the high command believed that continuing into the darkness would lead to a massacre. But as the men prepared to pull back, a lone voice rose above the din of mortar fire. A non-commissioned officer, staring up at the fortified cliffs of Saddleberg, turned to his commander and made a startling request. "Give me 20 minutes more." What happens when a soldier chooses not to follow an order to retreat, but instead asks for a few moments to finish the fight? If that soldier had pulled back, the Battle of Sattelberg might have dragged on for weeks, claiming hundreds more lives and potentially stalling the entire New Guinea campaign. By asking for those 20 minutes, he wasn't just being stubborn, he was trusting a tactical instinct that would lead to one of the most incredible feats of individual bravery in the history of the Pacific War. The man behind this legendary act was Sergeant Thomas Diver Derrick. He was not a general or a strategic mastermind, but a simple soldier from the working-class streets of South Australia who had survived the horrors of North Africa only to find himself in the green hell of the tropics. Derrick was a man who understood that in the chaos of jungle warfare, the window between victory and defeat is often no wider than a few minutes of pure, unadulterated grit. This is the story of a soldier who disobeyed his way into immortality. It is the story of how a 20-minute gamble broke a Japanese stronghold that had survived weeks of heavy artillery and tank assaults. This act of defiance would eventually earn Thomas Derrick the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration for valor in the British and Australian forces. But more importantly, it redefined what was possible for the individual soldier on the battlefield. As we delve into the blood and mud of Saddleberg, we ask ourselves, what drives a man to keep climbing when the world tells him to turn back? To understand why Thomas Derrick's actions were so pivotal, one must first understand the daunting presence of Saddleberg. Rising nearly 1,000 meters above sea level on the Huon Peninsula, Saddleberg was more than just a mountain. It was a natural fortress. From its summit, an observer could control the entire coastal region, directing artillery fire onto Allied supply ships and monitoring every movement on the beaches below. For the Japanese, Saddleberg was the anchor of their defensive line in New Guinea. For the Australians, it was a bloody roadblock that had to be cleared if they ever hoped to liberate the rest of the territory. The geography of the mountain was a tactical nightmare. The approach to the village at the peak followed a single, narrow, winding track, flanked by vertical cliffs and dense, primary rainforest. The Japanese 20th Division had spent months fortifying this terrain. They didn't just hide in the trees, they lived inside the mountain. They constructed a sophisticated network of interlocking bunkers, deep tunnels and spider holes, reinforced with coconut logs and earth. These positions were strategically placed at every bend in the track, creating killing zones where Japanese machine gunners could rain fire down on anyone attempting to climb. The task of seizing this fortress of the clouds fell to the Australian 9th Division, specifically the 248th Battalion, one of the most decorated units in the Australian Imperial Force, AIF. However, even for these veterans of the Desert War, the jungle was a different kind of monster. The Australians brought in Matilda tanks, hoping the armor would provide the necessary punch to break the Japanese bunkers. But the mountain fought back. The rain had turned the narrow tracks into a slurry of grease-like mud, causing the heavy tanks to slide toward the precipice and forcing the infantry to move forward without the protection of armor. Visibility was often reduced to a few meters by the thick mountain mist in the triple canopy jungle. Every step forward was a gamble against an invisible enemy. The Japanese defenders were experts in camouflage, remaining silent and hidden until the Australians were mere feet away, then unleashing a devastating crossfire from machine guns and mortars. This was not a battle of grand maneuvers. It was a grueling, inch-by-inch crawl through the mud, where the cost of every meter gained was paid in the lives of young men. As the Australians reached the final, near vertical slopes leading to the Saddleberg mission station, the resistance reached a fever pitch. The Japanese knew that if they lost the peak, they lost the peninsula. They fought with a fanatical intensity, launching counterattacks even under heavy Allied artillery barrages. By late November 1943, the 248th Battalion was exhausted, battered by the elements, and facing a defensive line that seemed unbreakable. The mountain sat shrouded in clouds, mocking the Allied efforts, standing as a silent testament to the brutal reality of the Pacific War. It was here, amidst the roots and rocks of this limestone giant, that the fate of the campaign would be decided. By the afternoon of November 24, 1943, the assault on Saddleberg had reached a grim and bloody stalemate. For 7 agonizing days, the men of the 248th Battalion had been throwing themselves against the Japanese Mission Ridge, and for 7 days the mountain had remained unconquered. The cost of this ascent was etched into the weary faces of the survivors. The 248th, a unit that had survived the siege of Tobruk and the sands of El Alamein, was being bled white in the New Guinea mud. In the week leading up to the final peak, the battalion had suffered devastating casualties. Dozens of seasoned veterans had been killed or wounded, and the jungle was claiming even more through malaria and exhaustion. Every company was under strength, and every platoon had lost brothers to the invisible snipers and the interlocking fire of Japanese bunkers. The tactical situation was a claustrophobic nightmare. The Australians were pinned down on a narrow razor-backed ridge with vertical drops on either side. There was no room to maneuver, no space for the Matilda tanks to assist, and the artillery was hampered by the thick canopy. Each time the Australians attempted to surge forward, they were met by a wall of lead. The Japanese 20th Division had perfected their defense. They waited until the Australians were mere yards from the crest, then opened fire with machine guns and showered the slopes with grenades. 3 separate major charges had been repulsed with heavy losses, leaving the hillside littered with the debris of war and the bodies of the fallen. As the light began to fade on that fateful Wednesday, the commander of the 248th, Lieutenant Colonel Hammer, surveyed the scene with a heavy heart. His men were spent. They were low on ammunition, soaked to the bone, and physically shattered by days of uphill combat in a vertical swamp. The Japanese were entrenched more firmly than ever, their spirits bolstered by their successful defense. To continue the attack in the encroaching darkness seemed like madness, a recipe for the total annihilation of the remaining forward troops. Under the weight of this reality, the order was finally given: withdraw. The companies were instructed to pull back to a more defensible position on the lower slopes, regroup, and prepare for a renewed, albeit uncertain, attempt the following day. For the soldiers of the 248th, the order was a bitter pill. Retreat meant abandoning the hard-won ground they had paid for in blood, and it meant having to climb that same deadly hill again in the morning. The withdrawal began in a somber, orderly fashion. Platoon by platoon, the Australians started to slip back down the muddy tracks, their heads bowed in exhaustion and defeat. It seemed that Saddleberg had won another day. The mountain remained a Japanese fortress, silent and menacing in the mountain mist. However, Sergeant Thomas "Diver" Derrick stood his ground. He looked at the ridge, then back at his retreating comrades, and knew that if they left now, the morning would only bring more death. It was at this moment of total deadlock that Derrick moved toward his commander to utter the 5 words that would change everything. As the withdrawal order rippled through the ranks, Sergeant Thomas "Diver" Derrick felt a surge of cold, tactical clarity. He looked at the jagged limestone cliffs and the smoking muzzles of the Japanese bunkers above, then at the exhausted faces of his men. He knew with a haunting certainty that if they retreated now, the Japanese would reinforce the ridge overnight, and the bloodbath of the morning would be even worse. Ignoring the exhaustion in his own limbs, Derrick approached his company commander. His request was blunt, bordering on defiance. "Give me 20 minutes more, and we'll have this place." Without waiting for a formal countercommand, Derrick turned back toward the enemy. He didn't order a mass charge. Instead, he led his small platoon in a calculated vertical ascent. The terrain was so steep that the men had to sling their rifles and climb hand over hand, gripping tree roots and jagged rocks to haul themselves up the cliff face. As they reached the ledge, the Japanese, believing the Australians had already fled, were caught in a moment of fatal hesitation. In the fading, eerie light of the New Guinea dusk, diver Derrick became a whirlwind of destruction. Moving with a speed that seemed impossible on such terrain, he sprinted forward alone under a hail of machine gun fire. He would scramble toward a Japanese bunker, wait for the precise moment between their bursts of fire, and then lob a grenade with lethal accuracy into the narrow firing slit. As the explosion rocked the earth, he would follow up with his Owen gun, clearing the position before moving to the next. He didn't stop at one. He moved through the maze of spider holes and log-reinforced bunkers like a ghost. At one point, he found himself pinned down by a Japanese light machine gun. While his men provided covering fire, Derrick climbed a tree to get a better vantage point, dropped back down, and charged the position with a handful of grenades. In that frantic 20-minute window, Sergeant Derrick single-handedly destroyed 10 enemy strongpoints. Each blast of his grenades signaled to the men below that the invincible fortress was being dismantled piece by piece by one man's sheer force of will. His bravery was infectious. The men who had been ready to retreat just minutes before now surged forward, inspired by the sight of their sergeant standing atop the Japanese parapets, silhouetted against the darkening sky, waving them on. By the time the 20 minutes were up, the impenetrable Japanese front line had been hollowed out. Derrick had not just cleared a path, he had broken the spine of the Japanese defense. As night finally fell over Saddleberg, the Australians were not in retreat. They were firmly perched on the lip of the summit, holding the ground that had been denied to them for an entire week. Diver Derrick had asked for 20 minutes, and in return, he had given his country a victory. When the sun rose on the morning of November 25, 1943, the expected morning bloodbath never materialized. The momentum generated by Diver Derrick's 20-minute assault had done more than just destroy 10 bunkers. It had shattered the morale of the Japanese 20th Division. Under the cover of darkness, the Japanese commanders, realizing their impregnable line had been breached by a force they could no longer track or contain, began a desperate withdrawal. The fierce warriors who had vowed to hold the peak to the last man were gone, leaving behind only the dead and the debris of a defeated garrison. The Australians of the 248th Battalion scrambled over the final rocks to find the Saddleberg mission station abandoned. The silence of the summit was a jarring contrast to the week of thunderous artillery and screaming banzai charges. At the very top of the ridge, Sergeant Thomas Derrick stood near a shell-blasted tree, watching as his comrades moved through the ruins. In a moment that has since become etched into Australian military folklore, the battalion hoisted the red ensign, the flag under which they fought, atop the highest point of the mountain. From the beaches of Finschhafen below, Allied troops looked up to see the flag fluttering in the mountain breeze, signaling that the fortress in the clouds had finally fallen. The fall of Saddleberg was the strategic breaking of the dam for the Huon Peninsula campaign. With this high ground in Allied hands, the Japanese lost their eyes and their shield. Their remaining forces in the region were forced into a disastrous retreat toward the northern coast, pursued relentlessly by Australian infantry and pounded by American air power. The victory ensured that the Allied sea lanes were safe and that the offensive toward the Philippines could proceed without a dagger pointed at its flank. Saddleberg was not just a hill, it was the psychological pivot of the New Guinea War. For the soldiers of the 248th, the victory was bittersweet. They stood on the peak they had bled for, but they looked back down the slopes at the path they had taken, a path marked by the graves of their friends. The miracle of the summit was shadowed by the reality of the price paid. Yet amidst the exhaustion, there was a profound sense of pride. They had achieved what tanks and heavy guns could not, proving that in the tangled green hell of the Pacific, the ultimate factor was the determination of the man on the ground. Saddleberg became a name synonymous with Australian grit. It proved that no matter how deep the bunkers or how steep the cliffs, the digger would find a way. Derrick's 20-minute gambit had turned a looming defeat into a legendary triumph, transforming a remote mountain mission into a symbol of national resilience. As the troops prepared to move on to the next objective, they knew they had participated in a battle that would be studied for generations, not for its grand strategy, but for the incredible power of a single soldier who refused to accept that the mission was impossible. To the men of the 248th Battalion, Sergeant Thomas Derrick was a hero, but to himself he was simply a survivor of the Great Depression who had found a new trade in the Army. Born in 1914 in the working-class suburbs of Adelaide, South Australia, Derrick's early life was defined by the harsh realities of poverty. He left school at 14 to help support his family, working a series of grueling jobs from farm hand to fruit picker. This upbringing in the school of hard knocks forged the physical toughness and the quiet, unassuming resilience that would later define his military career. He was a digger in the truest sense, a man of few words but immense capability. The nickname Diver was a testament to his character long before he reached the jungles of New Guinea. During his early training, a group of soldiers was crossing a river when one of the men accidentally dropped a precious boat oar into the deep, murky water. Without hesitation or a word of complaint, Derrick dove straight into the freezing current, disappearing beneath the surface only to emerge moments later with the oar in hand. The act was typical of the man. He saw a problem, he didn't wait for permission, and he fixed it. From that day on, he was no longer just Thomas. He was Diver. By the time he reached the slopes of Saddleberg, Derrick was already a seasoned veteran with a reputation for uncanny bravery. He had fought through the siege of Tobruk and the decisive battles of El Alamein in North Africa. It was during the North African campaign that he earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal, DCM. In a feat that foreshadowed his actions at Saddleberg, Derrick had single-handedly worked his way behind enemy lines and captured over 100 German soldiers. He possessed a rare tactical eye, an ability to read a battlefield, identify the enemy's weak point, and strike with surgical precision. However, it was his actions at Saddleberg that elevated him to the status of a national icon. For his 20 minutes of extraordinary valor, Thomas Derrick was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire. When the news of the award reached him, he reacted with characteristic humility, famously stating that he was only doing his job and that the medal belonged to his entire platoon. He didn't see himself as a legend. He saw himself as a sergeant responsible for the lives of his men. Tragically, the legend of Diver Derrick would have a somber end. After surviving the horrors of North Africa and the heights of Saddleberg, he was killed in action in May 1945 during the invasion of Tarracan. He died as he had lived, leading from the front, looking out for his men, and refusing to back down from a challenge. Today, his name is etched into the stone of memorials across Australia, but his true legacy lives in the spirit of the ordinary hero. Diver Derrick proved that a man from the humblest of beginnings could, through sheer force of character, change the course of history. He was the quintessential Australian soldier, tough, loyal, and possessed of a courage that was as deep as the waters from which he took his name. The story of Thomas Diver Derrick presents a profound paradox in military science, the fine line between insubordination and the stroke of genius. In any traditional army, ignoring an order to withdraw is a punishable offense that could lead to a court-martial. However, Derrick's actions at Saddleberg illustrate a concept known as tactical initiative, the ability of a soldier on the ground to recognize a fleeting opportunity that those in the rear command post cannot see. If Derrick had strictly followed the withdrawal order, the history of the Huon Peninsula would have been written in much more blood. A retreat would have allowed the Japanese to replenish their ammunition, booby-trap the paths, and reinforce their tunnels. The next morning's assault would have faced an even more determined enemy, likely resulting in a significantly higher body count for the 248th Battalion. Derrick understood that in the chaos of the jungle, momentum is a fragile resource. He realized that the Japanese were at their breaking point, and a final unexpected shove would do more than 1,000 artillery shells. This tactical disobedience was not born of arrogance, but of deep professional competence. It highlights a core strength of the Australian military tradition, the empowerment of junior leaders. The Allied command did not punish Derrick. They celebrated him. They recognized that the man in the mud, with his hands on the limestone cliff, has a clarity of vision that a general with a map can never possess. The lesson of Saddleberg remains relevant in modern leadership. While discipline is the backbone of an organization, it must never become a straitjacket that stifles instinct. Derrick proved that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to one's comrades is to have the courage to ask for 20 minutes more and the audacity to finish the job when everyone else is turning back. The legacy of Thomas Diver Derrick and the victory at Saddleberg is not merely a chapter in a history book, it is the embodiment of a spirit that defines a nation's military identity. As we look back at that rainy evening in November 1943, we see more than just a sergeant throwing grenades at bunkers. We see the personification of the digger, the Australian soldier whose reputation is built on a unique blend of egalitarianism, dark humor, and an iron-willed determination that thrives when the odds are most stacked against them. Derrick's climb up that near vertical cliff was a lonely journey, yet he carried the hopes and the safety of his entire platoon on his back. His success proved that even in the industrialized high-tech slaughter of World War II, the individual human spirit remained the ultimate factor on the battlefield. The Saddleberg spirit is the refusal to accept defeat when victory is just 20 minutes of agony away. It is the grit to keep climbing when your boots are heavy with mud, your lungs are burning, and the world is telling you to retreat. This quality, this relentless tenacity, is what made the Australian 9th Division one of the most feared and respected infantry formations of the entire war. In the broader context of the Pacific War, Derrick's exploit at Saddleberg serves as a reminder that heroes are often ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. He was a fruit picker from Adelaide who became a king of the jungle, not because he loved war, but because he was fiercely loyal to his mates and his mission. His story resonates today because it speaks to a universal truth, that one person, through a single act of courage and the audacity to speak up, can fundamentally change the destiny of thousands. Today, the heights of Saddleberg are quiet. The mist still clings to the limestone ridges, and the jungle has long since reclaimed the bunkers and the spider holes. But for those who study the history of the South Pacific, the mountain remains a sacred monument to the silent sentinels of the Australian Imperial Force. It stands as a testament to a generation of men who traded their youth for the freedom of others, fighting in a green hell so that future generations would never have to. We conclude this story with the image of a soldier standing on a peak, looking out over the clouds he has finally conquered. Thomas Diver Derrick didn't just capture a village, he captured the imagination of a country. His 20 minutes will live forever in the annals of military valor, reminding us that in the darkest hours of any struggle, the difference between failure and a legendary triumph is often just a little more time, a little more courage, and the willingness to take one more step upward.